Hello everyone, good afternoon. I hope you are all well, wherever you are. Welcome to Thinking on Sunday. If you're not familiar with Thinking on Sunday, it's the latest incarnation of a talk series that's been happening before Conway Hall, which opened in 1929, was founded. Firstly, it took place in South Ethical Place as an alternative to Sunday church sermons. And we are its current online broadcasting from people's kitchens and a shed in Lewisham for the lockdown. So welcome to Conway Hall in quarantine. Just quick, give you an idea of how things go. We have a speaker, they speak for 45 minutes on something of interest to ethics or thought, science, society, things that sort of help our mission as an ethical society to bring thought to people. Then we have a Q&A where we have the option of opening your microphone, but not your camera, just your microphone. So you can ask a question live to our speaker, or you can type it and I can read it out. And hopefully I'll get it as right as possible. So please, either option, please put your question into the Q&A bubble in Zoom, and we can let you know if we're going to open your open your microphone or just read out your question. So we should be done by about 4:30. As you're all in your houses, we like to keep things a little bit more. It flows much better when it's not live. Even though we are live, we just on a laptop, not in a room. Sorry. So an expert speaker will be with us in a moment, and not me. We're really happy to have Juan Enriquez speaking for us. Juan is the author of As the Future Catches You, Evolving Ourselves, and other books. This afternoon, he'll be speaking on his latest book, Right and Wrong, How Technology Affects Ethics, a subject obviously is very close to our heart at Conway Hall. He has contributed to such publications as the Harvard Business Review and to Foreign Policy. He's a co-founder and investor in brain and synthetic biology startups. I bet you couldn't guess I was reading that last bit out. Do please welcome to Thinking on Sunday online, Juan Enriquez. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for taking part of your Sunday to think and talk about ethics. And I think without further ado, what I'd like to do is to get straight into a small part of this book. As Scott said, this is Right Wrong, How Technology Transforms Our Ethics. And just think back on the last few months. How many of you have been feeling frustration, indignation, fear, dread, rage, fury, and above all, perhaps fear? And of course, I'm talking how many of you were feeling this before coronavirus hit us, because coronavirus just magnified this. And as I sort of think back on what's driving all these emotions and why are we all feeling so absolutely afraid, and where does this fear come from? Well, I think this fear partly comes from politics, because politics has gotten very wonky and very strange, and it's almost like we're living in a simulation where people are deliberately pushing stuff that would be insane. The economy's not doing terribly well. We've gotten very afraid of the others. So part of the way in which we've been tearing our societies and ourselves apart is we've been defining more and more people as the others. And then of course there's the enlightened. And those are some of the scariest people. The people who think they know absolutely right from wrong on whatever side. The effect of this in the United States and in Britain and in a series of other countries is very similar to what happened in World War I. So you can pick your symbols on the left side or on the right side. And once you pick those symbols, once you pick your side, then you're inside that trench. And you're shooting at the people in the other trench. And there's just not a lot of middle ground on this. right? Anything in between, any questioning of ethics, of positions, of, you know, maybe that was a sensible comment. Maybe that person has a point. That's a no man's land if you're in one of those trenches. And if you try and enter no man's land in a political debate or an ethical debate, very often not only will the other side shoot at you, but your own side will shoot at you. And part of the reason why this is so important is because once you're in that trench and once there's no alternative to that trench, then you enter the territory of Voltaire, right? And those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And that's a very dangerous place to sit, because then you're sitting side by side with Donald Trump, or you're sitting side by side with Boris Johnson, or if you're a supporter of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, then you're sitting side by side with you know, somebody else if you're an opponent. And you know, we already know that no human being's perfect. Some of the folks in leadership positions these days are especially flawed. And so entering a system based on trench warfare, where it's all or nothing with this person, is a very dangerous ethical place to sit, because you can end up doing stuff that you really don't want to do. Most people are in the middle somewhere. So there's a huge debate going on in the United States right now. Do you support the police or do you support Black Lives Matter? And the signs in front of houses pretty much tell you not just, does this person support this or do they support that? They often tell you this person's against that because of the way that the political debate has been moving. But that's not really true, because when you ask, do you support Black Lives Matter? It turns out that about 67% of the United States did in June. So not everybody's putting out signs. In fact, maybe 1 to 2% are putting out signs. But there's a general feeling this is a legitimate cause. Now, the way that these trenches are structured, if you have that sign, then you do not put out this sign, which is the thin blue line sign, because then you're supporting the police. And it turns out that the people who want to defund the police are only 31%. So in a rational society, you would see, we support the police, and then another sign on the same lawn, and then another sign, BLM. Because together as a more diverse society, we are stronger. But that's not what you're seeing in this structure. And there's a couple reasons why you have to pay attention to ethics and think about ethics as a living, breathing system. Because often ethics is taught as the single most boring document on the planet. And it's the typical document that you get when you go to your first job, or go to your next job, or start teaching at a university, or arrive at a university. And they give you, along with the human resources package, a principles of ethics for Corporation X, or for the university. And by God, this thing's written by Captain Obvious. If you don't know that stuff, you have no business working for these nice people, and you have no business teaching in this place. Once you read that document, or once you take the ethics introductory seminar, which is required for every new employee and often for new students, then you think you can put ethics aside. And that's a really dangerous way to teach ethics, because ethics is a living, breathing system, and it's evolving very quickly, and people learn. So when you ask the question, do you support kneeling during the national anthem in national football games? When Colin Kaepernick, a famous quarterback, started doing that in August of 2018, he had about 43% support. And gradually it has grown as the Black Lives Matter and a series of incidents have taken place. So now you've got 56% support for this. So the society is moving quite quickly for an ethical construct on a fundamental issue, which is respect for the national anthem. And this is occurring time and again. And, you know, when I spent most of the last decades studying and building companies in genetic research and gene editing and the brain and how you map the brain, how you change the brain, etc. And every time that I gave a lecture on this stuff, I was asked about ethics. So I spent the last 6 years thinking about how does one think about ethics? Because it was very hard to answer those questions in 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And so as I started thinking about ethics, I started thinking back to who taught me ethics. Where did I learn right from wrong? And what was I taught? And I went to school in Mexico. I grew up in Mexico. And I went to a Jesuit grammar school, and I went to this church. And back then, the Mass was in Latin. I was required to go to Mass every morning from 7 to 8 a.m. The priest never faced us. So from first grade through sixth grade, every day I'd see this thing. And, you know, they would teach me ethics alongside with other folks. And so one of the things that came out pretty clearly is you shouldn't have sex before marriage. Sex is for married men and women. And very rarely was it addressed, but when it was addressed, there is no way ever, under any circumstances, that a relationship between two men or two women is to be justified and accepted. And the way that translated onto the soccer fields or the school playground was any kid who was effeminate was called all kinds of names that I'm not going to use. There are still chants like this at soccer games. And, you know, it was considered normal and natural to harass somebody who seemed to be effeminate, to accuse somebody of being effeminate, to insult people. And basically, I was brought up to be a bigot by my parents, priests, teachers, peers, the law, the government. Everybody who was supposed to teach me ethics would tell me, you know, this is the way it is, and this is completely unnatural. I went to a very fancy high school in the United States. There was no discussion of being gay. The second private gay student association in a private high school in the United States was founded at that high school 15 years after I left. And it was founded with a small notice in the Philippian paper that said, GSA meeting, all welcome. And that was it. 15 years after I left. So in that context, had I not left Mexico, had I not met my first openly gay person freshman year in college who taught his macho hetero friend and had the patience to teach me, you know, you're just completely wrong on this, I probably would have remained a bigot because that's what I was taught. So when I go back to Mexico and I talk to people who are completely against gay marriage, I have some idea of where they come from. And what's fascinating to me and what's really interesting about ethics is you can take something that you're taught as a child, you can take something that is supposedly a fundamental moral issue to a lot of your ethical leadership or religious leadership. And you can have a situation where in 1997, 27% were for gay marriage in the United States and 68% were against. And fast forward that to 2017, and it's now flipped 180 degrees. And again, what's fascinating about this is all of a sudden, if you're against gay marriage, if you're practicing what you were brought up to learn, then your business should be shut down, you should be boycotted, you should be shunned, you're on the wrong side of history. And that is a very complex place to sit, because a lot of people get completely discombobulated by this stuff. If you think of the situation of one of the most moral people in the world, that's the Pope. You can say the Pope is too liberal, you can say the Pope is too conservative, you can say I don't like the Pope, or the Pope is irrelevant to me. But what you can't say is that the Pope doesn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about moral issues and ethics. And so presumably he's one of the people who truly spends a lot of time thinking and wondering and parsing what is right and what is wrong. And again, somebody like this in June 12th, 2010, talked about the Marriage Equality Act and basically said in a letter to the Carmelite nuns, here is also the envy of the devil. Don't be so naive. It is not a simple political struggle. It is a destructive attempt against God's plan. He's pretty clear on how he feels about marriage equality and marriage between two people of the same sex. And again, this is June 12th, 2010. Fast forward 3 years and about a month, and he gives one of his most famous interviews ever. If someone is gay and searching for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? So here is this absolutely fascinating ethical transition between an absolute statement here and a very different position 3 years later. And so if he can figure out that he's on the wrong side of history, if he can figure out that, you know, the position he took is unsustainable or should be changed, then we better think about our own notion of right and wrong and our certainty of right and wrong, and the possibility that even if we're right today, we could be wrong tomorrow, or that we might have been completely wrong even though we thought we were right. And that's where ethics becomes fascinating. That's where ethics becomes interesting. That's where ethics becomes something that you live with and search for. And it's an especially important question these days because there's so much certainty. There's so many people running around feeling illuminated by God or by their peers or by their beliefs or by whatever. And they say, I am right and you are wrong. And when you go back to the trench warfare metaphor, it's not just that you're shooting across no man's land at people on the other side. There's a lot of people inside your trench that are shooting at you. And again, this is a very complicated place for ethics to sit, because sometimes you fear those within your own trench and tribe. And you know, you're terrified that you'll be at a dinner and say something that will be supportive of the other side, or that will be politically incorrect, or that will get you exiled from the tribe, or that somebody surfaces something you said a year ago or 10 years ago. I mean, you think of these sudden gotchas of the Prime Minister of Canada wore a costume he should not have worn 20 years ago. And, you know, it's his own tribe that is shooting at him. So what ends up happening is sometimes you fear your own as much as you do the others. Because one wrong tweet or word or joke or photograph or speech or endorsement, or even a photograph sitting at a dinner next to the wrong person, even if it happened long, long ago, ends up really hurting you. And people have gotten really judgmental. They are so certain that they are right. They are so certain that their ethics are correct. They are so certain they're on the right side of history that it makes it terrifying for college administrators or professors or bosses, or maybe even some of you. You're walking on eggshells, and you can be burned at the stake in a Twitter storm and have your career vaporized in an afternoon or in a couple of hours. And again, because you said something stupid, or you went on a rant, or you called somebody something you shouldn't have called them, whether you realized that that was insulting or whether it wasn't the right name, it doesn't matter. And there's no context for how you were brought up. There's no context for what you learned. There's no context for your learning. And there's no context for that happened 20 years ago and you learned since. That creates a very awkward system where you're certain that you are right, that we as a group are right, but you also end up crazy insecure because you're always thinking, oh my goodness, what happens if I say something wrong? And as you're thinking of the structure, as soon as you take the position that says, I know right from wrong, then there's no space for discussion, right? You've created two trenches. You're on my side or you're on the other side. There is no tolerance. There is no evolution thinking. There's no learning. And above all, there's no humor. God help you if you joke about these things. People who are certain they are right do not tolerate humor against their own side. They love humor against the other side. Here's where it becomes interesting. Let's assume for a second that you are Mother Teresa or whatever your favorite figure is. And you actually are right. And you're 100% right. And you're a saint, right? And there's not a lot of those, but let's assume for a second that you are. Even if you are right, what happens if our notion of right and wrong changes over time? So what happens if you're right today, but it actually changes tomorrow? So let me give you a couple of examples across time. It used to be that the sun wouldn't rise unless if you practiced human sacrifice. So they built pyramids in Teotihuacan where they would take out a live beating heart and use a skull to build pyramids. And so under those circumstances, not only was human live sacrifice considered right and part of a justified religious ritual, it was essential for the survival of society. We have since learned that if the priest sleeps in and 20 virgins aren't sacrificed, the sun will still rise. And that religion vaporized. It turns out that we thought it was normal and natural and fun to have public executions in the town square. And that would be the Saturday evening entertainment instead of watching these ethics lectures. And again, a lot of society supported this and thought that was normal and natural. It used to be that you couldn't get married between races. It used to be that gays couldn't get married. So there's example after example where the people who are considered the most upright and ethical of the society and uphold all the laws of the time end up being completely wrong. And again, for those of you who are absolutely certain of your position and what you're doing, what is okay today may be completely wrong tomorrow. Let's explore that through this album cover. So there's a whole series of reasons why this album cover could be deemed politically incorrect today, in 10 years, in 30 years, in 50 years. And maybe some people will focus on the nun in the trailer window. Maybe some will focus on the depiction of a trailer park. Maybe somebody will focus on the scantily clad women. But there aren't that many people who are immediately going to gravitate towards the chicken on the grill. And yet in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, that may be the single most politically incorrect thing in this photograph. And part of what drives that is these changes in technology. So technology often alters the majority's view. There's always people who are at the leading edge, the early adopters, the smarter ethicists, etc. But that's not the majority. And what's happening today in the meat system is that a synthetic hamburger cost $230,000 in 2013. And not surprisingly, not a lot of people were eating synthetic hamburgers. It cost about $30 a hamburger in 2015. And it cost about $9 in US restaurants last month. And these are burgers that have no cow. So they're branded as cruelty-free. Now, in the measure that synthetic meat becomes faster, better, cheaper than real meat, in the measure that it is widely available, in the measure that it is widely consumed, more and more people are going to start asking, so why was it that you would consume 6 billion animals a year and pen them up in cages and slaughter them? And so what's happening is, as technology provides an alternative, as technology moves the notion of where you can get a hamburger, then all of a sudden the previous system becomes untenable. And what I want you to think about is how photographs of grandpa and grandma walking into a fancy, fancy restaurant are going to look in a few years. So, do you know that grandpa and grandma used to go to the fanciest restaurant, and displayed at the entrance of that restaurant was pieces of rotting animals, and that was supposed to incite them to hunger, and they loved walking past this. They thought it was classy. Do you have any idea how photographs like this are going to be seen in 50 years or 100 years when we're consuming synthetic meats primarily? The traditional view of ethical evolution is that there's some discourse and some interaction between religion and philosophy and morals, and that's what advances ethics. And what I'd like you to consider is that, yes, this occurs, and there is a discourse between these three, but one of the primary, and increasingly the primary driver of ethics, is technology. And let me just unpack that for a second. For most of human history, it was very hard to generate more productivity per person. So the way you got rich is you oppressed more people. If your land had more serfs, if you could enslave more people, if you could indenture more people, then if there's not more productivity per person, the way you become a great king or a great emperor is you take over more lands and have more people cultivate those lands, pick those lands, mine those lands, defend those lands. And one of the few ways in which you got more productivity per person was to increase your horsepower. So if you were really lucky, then you'd give one horse or two horses. And what horses do is they provide about 4 to 7, 8 times as much labor per day as each person. So having a horse adds, call it 6 people to your farm on average. In this system, we spent millennia oppressing people. If you think of the history of China, Greece, India, Incas, Mayas, Aztecs, Africans, Americans, Brits, it was a history of enormous oppression of large numbers of people. So you would force people to work for you. You would capture people to work for you. Why did that change after millennia? There's 2 versions to this story. The one version is this one, which is that a series of enlightened philosophers and ethicists and preachers began saying, tut, tut, it is a really bad idea to treat human beings this way. And they were right. It was a horrible idea to treat people that way. But it had been a horrible way of treating them for millennia. So why suddenly, after millennia, did people listen to these folks? It's possible that it was a change in technology that made an enormous difference. And let me unpack that. Each barrel of oil contains about 10 years of human labor. When you're burning a barrel of oil and you're processing a barrel of oil, you're basically taking the labor of a person for 10 years. And when you use that to power thousands of horsepower in machines, all of a sudden you can generate absolutely enormous amounts of labor without having to oppress tens of thousands of people. And as you're thinking about that structure, one jet engine is doing the work of about 160,000 people. So when you fly from London to New York, remember those old Viking ships where they would manacle some poor schlub to an oar and the person would row every time the person up front beat the drum? Well, when you're flying from London to New York, you're basically taking the labor of 320,000 rowers to get you across that pond in 5 or 6 hours. So those machines are doing the equivalent of a Viking ship powered by 320,000 people. And no, you don't need 320,000 people to do that work. So all of a sudden it becomes faster, better, cheaper to use a jet engine or to use a car or to use a tractor or to use a combine than to use massive amounts of labor. And all of a sudden you don't need to have thousands of serfs. So here's what technology did to ethics. Life expectancy basically didn't really increase between the time of the Romans and the 1800s. And yes, the early stages of the Industrial Revolution were brutal. And yes, there were dips in this. And yes, the early stages of the Industrial Revolution hurt a lot of people. But industrialization overall led to a massive increase in life expectancy almost everywhere on the planet. Because all of a sudden you didn't have to work people to death for the first time in history. Because you had the technology where you could provide more, you could make more, and you didn't have to hurt as many people. Same thing happened to global wealth. There was no increase in productivity per person, and there was almost no wealth creation between the year 1 and the 1800s. And what's happened over a very short period of time is suddenly global wealth has exploded and become this absolutely enormously rich planet. And yes, that creates all kinds of other ethical dilemmas with fossil fuel emissions, with excess resource use, with X, Y, Z. But when you have this much wealth, it gives you enormous discretionality because you have enough. You did not used to have enough. So what technology has done is it's flipped ethics completely on its head. It's made what was ethical before and considered normal and natural by the Greeks and the Romans and the Incas and the Mayas and the US South, and flipped it. Let me give you an idea of how quickly technology is upending our ethics and how radically it's doing so. So let's assume for a second that you had a time machine and you could bring back your dear old grandparents. And because it's a time machine, you can bring back your dear old grandparents and their randy 21-year-olds. So now you've got your 4 grandparents sitting in front of you and you're going to talk about sex with them. And, you know, that's an awkward conversation, fair enough. But when you talk about sex, they probably knew a lot about it at age 21 because they were probably married by then. Here's the parts that would be a little bit weird. When you try and explain the pill to your grandparents, and they ask you what that is, you tell them, well, look, this is a mechanism that allows you to constantly have sex and never have a child. Now, that's the first time in history where you have decoupled the act from its ultimate consequence. Because throughout the animal kingdom, normally when you have sex, it results in reproduction. For most of human history, yes, there were crude contraceptives, but usually they failed eventually. So what the pill did, what contraceptives did, is it separated act from consequence. And then you can talk to them about IVF and say, oh, by the way, Grandpa, Grandma, I'm going through cancer treatments, and therefore I am going to conceive a child externally. And by the time you unpack what that means, you take an egg, you take a sperm, you put it in a petri dish, you mix it up. They're thinking to themselves, hang on for 1 minute. I used to think about this as the Immaculate Conception, and it was a miracle. So you're telling me that when you now conceive a child, two bodies never come together, never touch each other, may never be in the same room, and you're conceiving a child. Are you kidding me? And then, of course, you can talk about freezing eggs, freezing sperm, paying surrogate mothers. And that means that you can have identical twins born 30 years apart. So just these three technologies separate act from consequence, act from physical contact, and act from time. If you were to ask your grandparents, is this okay? Is this ethical? The chances are very high they'd say, hell no. And they'd consider you, at best, unethical, but probably a whole lot of other things, if not absolutely crazy and a liar. So how do you think about ethics and sex when what is acceptable changes all the time? And the reason why this is such an important debate is because we are about to have this debate in spades. So the first patent for a synthetic womb was issued in 1955. But it wasn't until a couple of years ago that you had these ewes that were conceived and brought up inside basically Ziploc plastic bags. So you created a viable external uterus to bring a ewe to term, leading to one of the great British tabloids to come up with perhaps one of the greatest headlines I've ever seen in any newspaper, which was, "You get a womb." But anyway, I digress. As you're thinking about this, I think there's a high yuck factor in a lot of you. Why would you conceive an animal externally? Why wouldn't you allow this to come to term inside the mother? How dare you do this? But as this becomes faster, better, cheaper, let's fast forward this conversation a couple of generations. You're brought back by your 70-year-old grandkids, and you're talking about this, and they say, "Grandpa, Grandma, why were you so primitive? Why did you dare take me on that crazy mountain biking expedition with me inside your body, instead of leaving me safe and sound inside the hospital? Why did you expose me to those crazy foreign foods and diseases when you went to visit country X? Why did you take me out hiking with wildfires?" And then there's, of course, a second consequence to carrying children externally. That second consequence is when you're inside a system that looks like this, instead of inside your mother's body, then it doesn't have to be a mother who gives birth. And there's also a huge temptation to edit the genes or edit other body parts in whatever is being held externally. And again, there's a very high yuck factor for most of us of what the hell do you mean you're going to edit babies? But fast forward again, and your grandkids are sitting in front of you and they're saying, "Why were you so primitive and superstitious that you did not edit out the cancer-causing genes? You left in a BRCA1, you left in a KRAS, you left in a P53, and now I've got cancer because you were superstitious and crazy. How dare you have done that? And again, you can flip the logic on this stuff. I don't know which way it's going to go. I'm going to guarantee that how we think about sex in a generation or two is going to be very different in terms of what's ethical and what's not ethical. And you're beginning to see that with CRISPR baby editing and these kinds of questions. Because it's not safe, it's not right, this wasn't done right, I'm not justifying this experiment, but I can easily see how this plays forward across faster, better, cheaper in 2 generations, to the point where it became illogical and backward not to edit genes that were damaging. Last point. Technology is exponential. And if technology changes ethics, you may expect ethics to change at exponential rates. And that's a really important thing to understand, because we had a lot of time to adapt to what was right and what was wrong, and often you weren't caught in one generation in these ethical divides, but increasingly you can be. Because transitions like the price of solar or the price of offshore wind or the price of batteries are just collapsing. And as they're collapsing, the notion that we ever burned fossil fuels, that we ever burned coal, that we ever burned oil is going to seem absolutely irresponsible, but it's going to do so from the viewpoint of, I've got faster, better, cheaper energy, I can condemn those in the past. And to a lot of folks, those of us who are still burning hydrocarbons are going to look like the people who used to hunt whales to light their houses, if they're generous. Technology impacts ethics often as much or more than religion does. In fact, new technologies often killed old religions. Think about what happened in one of the great plagues in history, the Justinian plague. Just after the Justinian plague, you had a massive increase in Islam. Part of the reason was the disarray in the Justinian world. Part of it was the organization and weaponry of some of the Muslim generals. But there was something else going on. Here's one religion during a plague that says, baptize once and maybe take a bath once a year. And here's a second religion that says, you must wash your face, hands, feet 5 times a day. Now, if you've got a great big group of worshipers over here that says, God, please protect us from the plague, and never practices basic hygiene, and a group over here that's practicing basic hygiene, on average, guess who God is going to protect? So technology changes ethics. And because it's changing ethics, and because ethics are changing ever faster as technology is doing, we need to start bringing back words into today's highly polarized environment that have been basically vanished. These are words that we don't use today. Words like humility. Words like humility and forgiveness. When we judge people, when we judge the past, when we say, I am right, you are wrong. When we judge our peers and say, I am right, you are wrong. We may wish to do so with a little bit more humility and be a little bit more forgiving of the past based on how did people act in the context of their time? What were they taught? Versus just doing it from the viewpoint of our enlightened right selves. That is not saying what they were doing in the past was right. I am not trying to justify in any way, shape, or form the way we treated human beings. I'm trying to understand why could people have believed for millennia and acted for millennia in what we now know is such a non-ethical way. I'm arguing that we should judge our ancestors with a little more kindness and really hope that our descendants do the same. because we have been electronically tattooed in the way that no generation before us has ever been tattooed. If you think you know a lot about, kings in the 1500s or in the 1700s, it is nothing compared to what people are going to know about you. Your grandkids are going to know so much about you and your desires from your dating profiles, your opinions from your tweets, your daily activities from Instagram, or your credit card use, or your pictures, or PayPal. All of you have been electronically tattooed. Those tattoos do not go away. So the amount of material with which you can be judged for everything you did throughout your life, every minute, is astronomical compared to past generations. And if some of the things we're doing today are unethical tomorrow, you're going to be in big trouble. Unless, if we start creating an ethos where we have a little bit more forgiveness and a little bit more humility, where we create safe spaces to disagree with one another, to understand why somebody can hold a different point of view. And that's what allows us to isolate the extremes where there really are lousy people. I'm not arguing everybody's a good person. I'm not arguing everybody should be in the middle. I am arguing that when we shoot at each other from two different trenches, what we do is we put ourselves in the same trench with some truly lousy human beings and begin to adopt their positions, their morals, their tales. So don't automatically condemn all those who disagree. Even you, enlightened you, may not always know right from wrong. And especially, even if you do know right from wrong, what you think today is right may shift in a fundamental way as technology advances. And even you might end up on the wrong side of history. And this is why ethics is such an interesting, living, fascinating stuff. So let's see if there are any comments, questions, accusations, rebuttals.
Thank you, Juan. No one's put a question into the Q&A yet. Please do that, or put your hand up, or communicate us by chat. It'd be good. That was a thought-provoking talk that was beautifully laid out. Thank you. One thought, as no one else has chipped in yet, my thought is about gene editing, and also our evolving view of ethics and who people are. I can imagine not many people will be against the idea of being able to edit hereditary conditions or potential cancerous growth from our future children. There's always that fear, though, that people could at least attempt to edit out things like that are also sometimes inherited conditions, like say autism or homosexuality, in a way of creating a people that they believe to be perfect. What do you think about that? I normally don't chat to speakers.
So, again, you have to think in different time scales because things are accelerating. So you don't even have to get to the point where you're editing ethics. Editing genes. But you may want to pretty quickly. So I think the single most important photograph ever taken by human beings was taken on Valentine's Day in the 1970s. And what they did is they took the object, which is the furthest human object ever placed in space, which was Voyager, and they ordered it to turn around and take a photograph. And please, after this talk, go and look it up. It's a picture called Pale Blue Dot. And what you see, and what you see is these bands that look almost like Saturn's rings. And in the middle of one of these bands, there's a tiny, tiny white dot, almost like a pixel on a page. And here's the deal. Every human being and everything that has ever been alive on Earth lived and died on that pale blue dot. And that's it. And the universe is a really nasty place. When you see these beautiful pictures of these supernovas, or you see an incredible picture last week of the spaghettification of a sun. So it's a black hole, and you see this string of light coming out of a sun into the black hole. In essence, what's happening is the black hole is eating every piece of matter in that sun and all the solar system around that sun. All the planets are being get vaporized in that one picture. So these supernovas and these things are unimaginably violent events. And what that's telling you is you really want to get life off this planet, because there are a lot of things, starting from the sun expansion to meteorites to supernova explosions to wandering black holes to colliding stars, that can wipe out this little planet just as we mop up a little piece of dust on the table. I mean, it's on that scale. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Evolution has occurred in such a way that we are adapted to this planet. And if we want to live on some other planet, we're going to have to do some pretty serious genetic engineering to travel for longer, to live for longer. It takes 14,000 years at today's speeds to get to the closest solar system. We're going to have to engineer radiation resistance. We're going to have to engineer different gravity. We don't even know, if you conceived of a child in space and you took that initial fertilized egg and then it goes through a pachinko-like series of divisions, you're building 10 trillion cells. And this one goes to bone, and this one goes to stomach, and this one goes to eye. You don't know if that's going to occur at the same rate with a different gravity. So, A, we have to get life off this planet. If you believe in human rights, if you believe life is important, you want to diversify it. You don't bet everything on 17 black. And the second thing you want to do is you want to do some pretty radical re-engineering to be able to place stuff and live on other planets. And that's an argument that we're going to be facing in the next 100 years, because you have so much space stuff going up, right? So it's not just engineering genes to attack cancer, it's engineering genes for the survival of life somewhere off this planet. And those are questions we're going to face, I think, pretty soon.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go to some other questions in a moment. Even if that potentially threatens human diversity, though?
No, I think on the contrary. I think one of the things is it promotes human diversity. I think we're actually terrified of human diversity. You know, everybody's arguing we want diversity, we want diversity, we want diversity. No, you don't. Right? People are terrified of having diversity. And again, you get back to just not looking at and understanding human history and the consequences of human history. The more we learn about what lived on this planet, the more we learn that we coexisted with several species of proto-humans, whether you want to call them Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or Erectus or whatever else. Not only did we live side by side with other human species, we actually interbred with a lot of other human species. So a lot of us carry Neanderthal genes. Some of those who carry an excess of Neanderthal genes have ended up in politics. And we see the consequences every day. That was a joke, by the way.
I know, I get that. I get that. I was about to say not all Neanderthals, though. I'm sure some of them turned out okay. Okay, I'm going to unmute the microphone of JVW. I'm hoping you're not a robot, or it doesn't matter if you are a robot or not. You had a quick question.
So my question was, do some ethics hold, for example, prohibitions against murder, envy, choose some other ones from the tablet?
So we tell ourselves a lot of lies. And we tell ourselves a lot of lies and we believe them. And we do tremendous damage when we don't question ethics, when we don't understand ethics, and we think we know right from wrong. So let's go very specifically to a tablet that you mentioned, where the words are written in stone. Thou shalt not kill. There is not an asterisk on that goes to a footnote that says, thou shalt not kill except under these circumstances. But it turns out that there's all kinds of variations on that theme. So when you talk to chaplains on military bases, they are not teaching thou shalt not kill in an absolute, because otherwise every person who goes through boot camp would be a pacifist. And armies would be armies of pacifists. You can argue whether they should be or shouldn't be, but that is not the way thou shalt not kill is being interpreted. Thou shalt not kill, you know, there's all kinds of ethical dilemmas that ethicists love to drop in front of freshmen. There's the trolley problem, you know, do you pull it this way, do you pull it that way? The answer to that one is thou shalt not kill, right? But that's not the way the problem is phrased. It's what is the greater good, as opposed to the absolute. So we say thou shalt not kill, and yet that is not what we practice. That is not what we've practiced for tens of thousands of years, and we do enormous damage and disservice to ourselves by taking an absolute position and saying this is the position and that is true for everything everywhere and there is no exception, because there wouldn't have been a Battle of Britain. Stalin would probably, or people like Stalin would probably be in power. And if you cannot think of a single exception of thou shalt not kill, I hope you never have somebody or yourself that is truly sick and hurting with a disease that has no outcome but enormous pain for a long period of time. I don't know which side you end up on, but you should at least ask the question, as opposed to turn around and say this was written in stone. Because a lot of stuff that was written in stone turned out to be wrong. Let me take that a tiny bit farther. 99% of the world's religions have gone extinct. So when you go to the great museums in Britain, one of the things you're seeing is dead gods. So there's the god of Zeus, and there's Neptune, and there's Ram, and there's the god of corn, and there's the god of the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayans. When religions don't have a dialogue with technology and when religions don't adapt and adopt, they go extinct, just like species do.
Okay, thank you for that. I think Justin Gallant had a sort of following on from that theme. I just lost his question, hang on. I'm struggling with the technology. It asked, you mentioned that there are always early adopters. However, what we also see is not only early adopters, but those against some of the most atrocious actions we've taken throughout history. For example, people who opposed slavery. How do we navigate truly unprecedented atrocities when there are people who are very lucid in their ethical opposition from the beginning?
There are always geniuses among us, right? I mean, if you look at physics, if you look at chemistry, if you look at poetry, if you look at art, the same is true of the field of ethics. There are people who get it faster, better, smarter than any of us do, and they get it earlier. So there have certainly been an enormous amount of people who were abolitionists way before the Industrial Revolution. But when you look at the history of slavery, there are very few instances where slaves were freed voluntarily by a society. One of them did occur in Venice during the golden age of Venice, because Venice was making so much money that they took their slaves and they made them free people. So again, it's an instance where the society has so much, it can do that and prosper. But that is not the norm. So I'm not arguing that there aren't people who aren't more enlightened than I am, than almost all of us on ethics. I'm not arguing there aren't people who understand a better way of understanding right way before the rest of us do. But But the area where I'm interested in is where does the majority suddenly shift on something that's the ethical norm into something that is completely different. And that's the point where it gets interesting to me, right? Absolutely valid, important to look at people who are arguing against this in the year 1000, in the year 300. Absolutely. But why didn't society listen to them? Why didn't the majority shift? Why didn't it become the norm? That's the part that interests me.
Okay, thank you, Juan. The next question comes from David Wood. David, you've written quite a long question here. I respectfully request you keep it brief because we've got other questions coming, but it's time for your question with Juan.
So Juan, super talk. I really like your invitation for us all to have a bit of humility in terms of how ethical frameworks may evolve. I wonder about genetic editing. You're suggesting that we may in the future be keener to genetically edit our children or ourselves, possibly, for physical characteristics, but what about mental characteristics? Might we say that although some neurodiversity is to be applauded, there are some people who have very destructive mental states. They are prone to depression, they are prone to negativity. Might we now take it for granted that we should, as parents and as editing ourselves, want to tweak our genes to make us have a better positive mental attitude and more emotionally resilient?
So I spent, the last 30 years thinking about genetics and genomics and working in the field and trying to help map and shape the field. And the book I did before this one was called Evolving Ourselves, Redesigning the Future of Humanity, One Gene at a Time. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. The thing that so let me take this in two parts. I am pretty certain that we're going to be able to reproduce every one of our body parts almost like Lego blocks in the next 50 years. And that sounds crazy, except that every one of your cells contains your entire gene code, with the exception of some blood cells. So the genes that are inside the cells of your skin, or your eye, or your nose, or your stomach, contain the entire human genome. So you've got about 6.4 billion letters of gene code inside there, folded into a trillionth of an inch. And that instruction set allows you as a baby to grow a set of teeth. And that instruction set allows you to grow a second set of teeth. Why in the world doesn't that instruction set get used again to grow a third set of teeth like lawyers and sharks do? Right? I mean, there's a fundamental question, which is if that instruction set is there, if you lose a tooth when you get older, why don't you regrow it a third time? In the same way as you regrow your skin after it gets sunburned. In the same way as you regrow your bone once you break a bone. And the answer is, we're getting closer and closer to understanding how to regrow cartilage, how to regrow heart tissue, how to regrow tracheas, how to regrow bladders. And in fact, we're starting to implant most of those. We will get to the point where we will be able to regrow our livers and regrow our eyes. That's not that complicated. That is 50, 100 years away. But the part that you're getting at, which is the really important part, is you cannot substantially increase human longevity without being able to understand, map, reproduce, and download brains. And that's why I shifted the labs that I work in from genomics to brain science and synthetic neurobiology. And that's why the next book I'm working on is how do you map the brain? How do you alter the brain? How do you change the brain? And that's why I wrote this book on ethics before I started that work, because you don't really alter humanity if you take out cancer genes. But boy, do you alter humanity if you start changing brain function. And that's where ethics gets really complicated and interesting and fascinating. And let me unpack that if you have the patience for 1 minute. One of my great friends, who's somebody that I've founded a brain company with, was getting her PhD at MIT, and suddenly she ended up drooling in a wheelchair, ready to die in her mother's basement. And it was a pretty fast decline. And it took the doctors a long time to figure out that it was a brain tumor that was causing that. And they extracted the brain tumor, but when they extracted the brain tumor, they also eliminated her ability to make most hormones. So if she doesn't take pills twice a day, she dies. I mean, literally, just boom, she's dead. So when she travels, she carries a supply of these pills inside her handbag. She carries one inside her suitcase. She has pre-placed orders in pharmacies where she's landing, and she's pre-placed orders in pharmacies anywhere that plane can be diverted to. So if there's fog in London, it lands in Frankfurt. There's a pharmacy there with these medicines. She travels all over the world. But what's fascinating about her experience is, instead of taking the exact prescription the doctor gave her, she acted like a scientist, and she took a spreadsheet and said, okay, what happens if I mix this with this? What happens if I take this at different times? What happens if I take this at different doses? And it changed fundamental aspects of her mood and even her sexuality. So suddenly she ended up feeling like a 17-year-old boy. And all she could think about was violence and sex. And she tried that for 3 days and thought, that's interesting, wrote down her observations, and then tried something else. And then eventually she got to the point where she and her husband found a place where they were both happy. But what that experiment is teaching you, and what the experiment that a lot of people who are going through transgender surgery or who have gone through brain surgery or a series of other things are teaching you, is that you can fundamentally alter moods and even actions through brain chemistry. And boy, does that lead to some complicated questions, right? It would not be surprising if some of our grandkids have a school curriculum where for a week they live gay, because you've altered the gene chemistry so that you put yourself in somebody else's shoes. But the flip side of that is, if you can run that safely, then maybe you can decide to run the reverse. And that gets really complicated, right? Because it comes back to Scott's question about diversity. And we say we like diversity. We don't really like diversity. We eliminated every other variant of human beings on this planet that live side by side from us. And we're afraid of it. We're afraid of the other. We're afraid of the diverse. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to shoehorn everybody into our tribe, our notion of right and wrong, our way of being, and telling everybody else, you have to act this way, otherwise you're not a decent human being. It's a very complicated time because it's a very polarized time.
Okay, thank you for sharing that one. Like a lot of humans, I probably think that I am all in favor of diversity and I love it. I know as humans, we don't like diversity. There's a question here from JG Chaser. I'm really sorry if I've mispronounced your name. They ask, are you saying that ethics rely on context, and that the context being now more technologically driven implies that human ethics will struggle to cope with the new context? The reason for my question is that ethics relies on some human logic that can also be augmented by AI or machine learning. So this sort of follows on a little bit from what you were just saying, thus assisting humans in determining right from wrong. If yes, is there a danger that lazy humans will delegate completely ethics to artificial intelligence? Are we going to just sneeze our way to the singularity?
So sometimes even the most innocent programming can lead to unintended consequences. There was a town that had very well-intentioned hackers in the US. And what they did is they took cell phones and they asked people in the town to download a program which would indicate where potholes are. So you'd be driving along and the phone would hit a pothole and it'd do this. It, would bounce up and down. And the town would know there's a pothole here and it's a big one or it's a small one or whatever. And they deployed the public works to fix those potholes. Well, that's a great use of a relatively simple technology, except that what they found is the rich sections of town got fixed and the other ones did not. And the reason why is because the chances that you had a cell phone, that you drove a car, that you knew to download the program and that you use the program increased substantially in the measure that you were part of the richer part of that community. And the people who didn't have cell phones, the people who didn't know this, the people who didn't access these programs, they weren't sending the information. So you ended up having this very weird division in the town where all of these potholes were fixed and none of these potholes were fixed, or very few of these potholes were fixed. So what's the point of this in terms of the context of artificial intelligence? All of us grew up laughing at these stories of, the poor schlub who gets an evil genie and says, I want to be taller than everybody else, and the genie cuts off everybody else's legs, or does something, horrendous. And we have to go back and read those evil genie stories and how they come about, because artificial intelligence is real. It's getting more and more prevalent. It's driving more and more things. And how you program that thing may have completely unintended consequences. Say you program something, I want people to have greater equality. And you let that loose across bank accounts. Well, you could easily see how you get big shifts from this bank account to everybody else's bank account because you programmed the machine to have that as the parameter. And maybe that's a good thing, but you better understand the consequence of what you're programming. I want everybody to live similar amounts of time. Well, boy, that one can be really interesting, right? So as you're thinking about programming AI, especially as you're tying it to systems that have more and more of an impact on our lives, like machines that keep us alive, or machines that drive us, be really careful what you wish for and reread those genie stories before you let the stuff loose. Understand the programming underneath, understand the consequences, and make absolutely certain you can reprogram. Don't, program and release.
Always make sure you've got a back door, or you're living in Logan's Run.
Yes, and this sounds abstract, except that most of the stuff that's traded on the world stock markets is traded without human intervention these days. It's traded through automatic algorithms. Because when you put in orders for ETFs, diversified mutual funds, in essence, what you're saying is rebalance this so that it's always in these proportions. And we don't understand where all these flash crashes are coming from, where all of a sudden the value of company X goes down 60% for 5 seconds and then comes back up. Well, that's what happens when you let, hundreds of thousands of independently acting, non-human mediated programs loose on stock markets, because you get these very weird structures. And we are not in charge of our financial trading, and that one's going to be expensive one of these days.
I can imagine. It's been a great talk and a great Q&A. I'm going to give the final question to Mariano M, who is, I believe, is live now. Hi, Mariano.
Hi. Yeah, my question is, tendentially, do you think a system of ethics are converging or diverging? And I am thinking of the different narratives that are growing out of the technology, the way of seeing things. Some people believe in creator's God, some others don't believe we got a permanent soul. Some people think consciousness actually is not in the brain. It might be out there and we are just instruments. And what does that mean? All that mean in terms of what life, individual life especially, is, when it begins, when it ends. What is the difference between us and orangutans, for example? Soon we will have aliens coming around. So are we converging? Because in the past we had centuries, millennia to try and adjust to each other's views on a world experience, common experience, which was not changing that much, whereas now it is already changing.
So many parts to that question. Because this is the closing question, let me define myself as an optimistic curmudgeon. There is a whole lot to be upset about in this world. There are things that are just going horrendously wrong. There is leadership that is absolutely inexcusable, and in historical terms is going to be seen as some of the worst leadership we've ever seen. Across things like pandemics, across things like how you're treating other people, across how you treat immigrants. The behaviors going on today and the behaviors that we are tolerating are just wrong. At the same time, if you were born at random in a John Rawls sense into any other period in history, and you didn't know if you were going to be African or Indian or smart or educated or rich or whatever, I don't know if there's a better time in history to be born. Do you really want to be born as an immigrant or as somebody with a different skin color into the 1900s or into the 1800s? Do you really want to be born as a woman in the 1950s? Would you have been treated better? Would you have better rights? So I think because technology is accelerating, because technology allows us to have more ways of being generous, because we have more, because there's less scarcity and there's more abundance, we have an opportunity that no other generation has had before, which is to treat each other better. Doesn't mean we're going to do it, but I do think we have the space to really think about ethics and to really think about our actions and to really understand how we can do things that previous generations didn't do. And what I'd love us to do is to judge the past a little bit less and judge the present a little bit more. And think very carefully about what we're doing today that may be thought of as really stupid and wrong-headed and unethical tomorrow. Because it's very easy to tear down statues. It's very easy to get furious justifiably because the actions were inexcusable. But let's spend a little bit more energy understanding, forgiving, educating each other on stuff we're doing today. Because that we can do something about. And part of that, part of that is bringing back history. But there's a whole lot of self-congratulation as to how we and our friends are, and a whole lot of condemnation and fury. And I think understanding ethics is something that is a living, breathing system that will help make us better is a very good use of time. So I really want freshman seminars in college to have people disagree without being terrified they're going to be ostracized. I really want professors to be able to bring forth ideas that some people may find offensive that can be debated. I really want people in companies to say, do you think this is really right? Because otherwise they're going to find out too late that they've been condemned. And I'm optimistic this can happen. I mean, I think groups like Conway Hall can do this. I think debates like this can do this. I think humility and forgiveness are incredibly important when you're sitting in trenches.
Okay. I just got a comment from the previous questioner saying thank you. In fact, we had a lot of comments saying how much people enjoyed the talk, found it fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed that one. Thank you for giving us your time, and we hope you have a good rest of day, because I know it's all ahead of you.
Happy Sunday to everybody, and I hope you have a nice port tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. Conway Hall is a charity which puts on thought-provoking talks. That's what we exist for. So do check out our website if you haven't already for other things. And yeah, hope you will stay safe in the future. My colleague has just put in the chat the link to our videos of previously recorded talks, and this talk will be up in due course. So thank you everyone, and good evening. Thank you.